I had always loved solo camping. There was something about being alone in the wilderness, the absolute silence, the sense of escape, that made it almost addictive. But after what happened in West Virginia, I don't think I'll ever go alone again. It was late September when I decided to head out to a remote forest I had visited once before with friends. This time, though, I wanted to experience it alone. I left my car in a small clearing at the end of an old logging road and set off on foot. The hike was about 3 hours, cutting through dense trees and long-forgotten paths. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. At first, it was peaceful. The leaves were starting to turn, painting the forest in shades of orange and red. The crisp air smelled of pine, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. I set up my tent near a small clearing, not far from a shallow stream. Everything felt normal, but that feeling wouldn't last. Night came quickly. I built a small fire, cooked my dinner, and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was calming, the kind of quiet that reminded me why I loved camping. Then I saw them. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Just beyond the fire's glow, standing between the trees, were figures. Tall, still, watching. I counted at least 6 of them. They weren't moving, yet I could feel their presence pressing against me like a heavy weight. A cold dread crept up my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the trees. The moment the beam cut through the darkness, they were gone. No movement, no sound, just the empty forest. I exhaled sharply, trying to shake the creeping paranoia. "Just shadows," I muttered to myself, "just my imagination." But something deep in my gut told me I was wrong. I forced myself to ignore it, retreating into my tent for the night. That was my first mistake. I woke up suddenly, not to a sound, but to the absence of sound. The usual noises of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, were gone. It was as if the entire world had gone completely silent. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate shuffling just outside my tent. I froze. Something, or someone, was walking in slow, measured steps, circling my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, barely daring to breathe. Then the footsteps stopped. Right outside the entrance, I clenched my fists. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to move. The silence stretched. Then breathing. Slow, deep, unnatural breathing. It was just inches away from me, separated only by the thin fabric of my tent. And then, in a voice that didn't sound quite human, it whispered, "Come outside." My blood ran ice cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Come outside." The tent fabric rustled, as if something was pressing its hand against it. I had to do something, with every ounce of courage I could muster. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, pointing it directly at the tent wall. The moment the light hit, the breathing stopped, the whispering stopped. I lunged forward, unzipping the tent in one swift motion. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness and revealed nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the endless dark forest stretching before me. But the silence remained, and I knew I wasn't alone. Sat awake the rest of the night, clutching my knife and flashlight. Every shadow seemed to move. Every shift in the wind sounded like whispers just beyond my hearing. I wanted to leave right then and there, but the thought of hiking through the dark forest, alone, was even more terrifying. So I waited. Dawn came, slowly. The moment the first hints of sunlight touched the trees, the normal sounds of the forest returned, as if the night had never happened. But I wasn't fooled. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and started the long hike back. The entire hike. Soon I felt eyes on me, no footsteps, no figures, but the presence never left. It wasn't until I was almost back to my car that I finally let myself breathe. Relief washed over me when I saw my vehicle through the thinning trees. But just as I reached for the door handle, I made the mistake of looking back, and there, just beyond the tree line, they were standing tall, still watching. But this time there were more of them, dozens, their hollow, empty faces locked onto mine. I scrambled into my car, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back again. I told myself it was over, that I had escaped. But even now, I know that's not true, because sometimes when the night is silent, too silent, I hear the whisper, soft, insistent, "Come outside," and I know they're still watching, waiting for me to return or for someone else to take my place. I never believed in ghost stories. They were just exaggerated tales, fabricated to scare people. That's what I used to think anyway. But after what happened to me, I don't know what to believe anymore. It was late October when my friend Tyler and I decided to go camping near an old abandoned village in Pennsylvania. The town had been deserted for decades, its history mostly forgotten. A few rotting houses, a collapsed church, and a rusted-over bridge were all that remained. We weren't there for the history, though. We just wanted an isolated spot to camp, somewhere quiet, away from the noise of the city. The drive took longer than expected, winding through narrow forest roads that barely showed up on Google Maps. The deeper we got, the heavier the air felt, as if we were leaving civilization behind entirely. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows over the decayed buildings. The place felt wrong, but we ignored it. We found a small clearing just outside the village and set up camp. Tyler got the fire going while I unpacked the sleeping bags. Everything felt normal at first. The air was crisp, the fire warm, and the stars faintly visible through the thinning branches. Then the fog rolled in, thick, heavy, unnatural. It crept in like a living thing, rising from the ground instead of drifting in from the trees. Within minutes, it swallowed the forest, the village, and everything beyond the glow of our campfire. That's when we saw him. A man, standing just beyond the tree line. Still, silent. He was tall, his figure barely visible through the fog. His clothes were old, tattered, something out of another century. We couldn't see his face, but we felt his eyes on us, watching. I swallowed hard. "You see that?" Tyler nodded, his grip tightening around the flashlight. "Hey!" he called. "Out? You lost or something?" No response. The man didn't move. A strange, uneasy feeling crawled up my spine. The way he stood there, so unnaturally still. It was as if he weren't even breathing. Tyler took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Let's just ignore him," I whispered. "Maybe he's a hiker." But we both knew that wasn't true, and as the hours passed, the man never left. He just stood there, motionless, watching. At some point, we gave up pretending to be comfortable and retreated into the tent. We told ourselves he would be gone by morning. We were so wrong. I woke up to a sound, a soft tapping against the fabric of our tent. Rhythmic, light, like fingers drumming just inches from my head. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to Tyler, but he was already awake, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The tapping came again, then another, all around us. Like multiple hands pressing against the tent, drumming lightly on the fabric. Tyler clutched his knife. His whisper was barely audible. "We run on 3. I swallowed and nodded, gripping my flashlight. 1. The tapping grew louder. 2. A deep rattling breath sounded just inches from my head. 3. We burst out of the tent, sprinting toward the ruins of the village. The fog was suffocating, so thick I could barely see my own hands. The air felt wrong, heavy, electric, like a storm was about to break. But we didn't stop. We ran. Somehow we reached the village. The buildings, once decayed and lifeless, didn't look abandoned anymore. Windows glowed with a faint, sickly light. Shadows flickered inside. Doors that should have been rotted away now stood half open, as if waiting. My chest tightened. "Tyler, something's wrong." He didn't respond, because that's when we saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the fog. Their bodies were wrong, too tall, too thin, their limbs slightly off. Their faces were hollow, and they were all staring at us. Tyler grabbed my arm. "Run!" But my legs wouldn't move, because one of them stepped forward, a man, dressed in old, tattered clothes. The same man we had seen watching us. His mouth opened, but no words came out, just a dry, rattling breath. Then the others started moving, not walking, drifting toward us. I don't remember how we got out. One second we were frozen in fear, and the next we were sprinting. The fog twisted around us, making it impossible to see where we were going. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, whispers slithering through the air. Somewhere behind me, Tyler screamed. I turned. He had fallen. I reached for him, but something moved between us. A shape, a figure, closer than before. I grabbed Tyler's arm and yanked him up, and we ran, blindly, desperately, until we reached the car. We didn't look back, didn't stop. We drove until we saw city lights again, until the fog was gone, until, we could breathe without feeling their eyes on us. But even now, I know we didn't truly escape. Because sometimes when the night is silent, when the fog creeps in just right, I hear the tapping, and I know they're still watching, waiting for the next ones to come.